absolutely fabulous to be here. It's a great honor to be part of this inaugural Reinvention Summit. Aidan mentioned my book, so I'm here with some business advice for you. Do not publish a book with entrepreneurial mindset in the title in the year 2000. It's not a good business strategy. But what I do want to share with you builds on what's come before, as I think was the design, and it's thinking about how do we actually go about architecting organizations that are capable of doing this, because it's not something any of us in our lifetimes have ever really experienced, except if you happen to be with exceptional organizations, and Netflix and Patagonia and others have come up. So I think we're starting to see the early warnings, the early signals of what could be. As the science fiction writer William Gibson very famously said, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. So what I'd like to do with the time we have is share with you some ideas from this new book that I'm trying to wrestle to the ground. It's sort of a good news, bad news story. If I'd finished the book on my original time frame, had it been published, it would already be obsolete. So that's the good news. The bad news is I kind of feel like I'm running to kind of keep up with where life is taking me. So it's been a very interesting journey so far. But I'm learning a lot, which to me is one of the big values that certainly I have. So speaking of the year 2000, let's take ourselves back in time to the tumultuous period of the 1990s. And what did many of us alive at that time experience? Well, we had this really exciting thing called dial-up internet. It was the web, right? And you all remember what that was like. And you plugged it into your phone. And then the big innovation, the big thing, was you could actually have the computer on the internet and you could make phone calls at the same time. So I have relatives at the time who lived up in the north, here in Ireland, and when British Telecom, which was their local provider, finally said, "Oh yeah, you can be on the phone and be on the computer at the same time," this felt like a revelation. It was amazing. And then we had, as the decade progressed, we started to get more and more information. We started to have this thing called high-speed internet access, and then Wi-Fi. You could carry this stuff with you everywhere you went. And investors started to notice. And so money started to pour into this sector, everybody looking for what's the next big thing, what's the next big breakthrough. We mentioned Amara's Law earlier today. We way overestimate how much change there's going to be in the near term and way underestimate how much change there's going to be in the long term. All right, so the 90s go and they come and they go. And it was 1999. You may remember Y2K. That thing, the world was going to end come the year 2000. Nuclear plants were going to become unstable and airplanes would fall out of the sky. And we should all move to Montana and stockpile wheat. There was actually a recommendation that people do that. And so the big moment, the big year 2000 happens. What happened? Nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? It's because we took that early warning, the thing that Aidan mentioned, that leading indicator of what could happen, and we actually took it really seriously. And that's sort of a metaphor for where I'd like us to go today, which is what are the early warnings and leading indicators we could look at? All right, so we're getting to the year 2000. The stock market, the NASDAQ anyway, reaches its all-time high. This is awesome. And then the bubble bursts, right? People start losing money. Famous investors like Fred Wilson lose 90% of their capital. But what's left behind, right, creates the foundation on which the internet, as we now know it, looking back with the wisdom of hindsight, was going to be developed. And this is the way inflection points in business tend to proceed. They often start out with a lot of just absolutely breathless hype. Then they reach some kind of tipping point when everybody goes, oh, this isn't a real thing. Then the bottom sort of falls out. But out of that stage, you have the survivors. You have the ones that are then going to show us what this next evolution in business is likely to be. And so too, I think with this bust, as it were. And you may recall, some of us who were around at the time will remember people were saying, oh, that internet thing, what a fad. It's like 3D television. It's going to be no more important than that. And yet today, of course, we realize that wasn't true. Now, in all of this is a Venezuelan economist called Carlotta Perez, who I admire greatly. And she had the temerity to publish a book about technological revolutions in 2002. 2002, a year when everybody had kind of written off what the potential of the internet was. Not everybody, but many people had said this is never going to amount to much more than another kind of form of communication. Similar to the way, the telegraph people said, oh, telephones, we're never going to need those for anything. That sort of use case for early adoption doesn't exist because we're locked in an old paradigm. So what Carlotta said was in 2002, she said, oh, this is perfectly normal. And this is the part that captured my imagination, to say, it's not prediction. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but there are predictable patterns that we can identify that will share, that can show us where we were, where we are, and what's likely to happen. And so Carlotta's theory basically says, you've got this eruption, this moment of new discovery, which she would pin in our current environment to the 1971 invention of the microprocessor. Then you have this period where people are sort of figuring this out. Capital gets really excited, and capital flows into what's often called a casino economy. And if you look at where we've been the last 10 years or so, there are definitely moments where these bubbles get created. Now, in a bubble, most of the participants in the investing class will lose their shirts. We know that. A few that win will win big. So what happens during that early frothy period is you have rising income inequality as the billionaires who win the winner-take-all markets cash in. You have the bulk of people who are still operating under the old regime beginning to find that their lifestyles are getting worse, they're getting paid less relative to the cost of things, because the old regime, which in our world is the regime of petrochemicals, mass markets, mass production, 5 million identical Barbie dolls, that kind of thing. That sort of economy, which worked really well. So what happens is the capital flows in there's a casino economy, we have this then period where the bubble bursts, and there's this tension, there's this, nobody quite knows where we're going, because where we are is in this transition from the old way of doing things to the new way of doing things. So what I'm hoping to do with my time here to you is give you some reflections, some musings on what this might mean for organizations. And I'm hoping to keep it practical. Right to be wrong here, this is not a finished product. This is the first time I'm ever giving this presentation. So I invite you to come along with me, and let's see if we can problem solve and think together in the spirit of this Reinvention conference. So if we think about organizing, the old regime, right? Mass markets, Henry Ford, Toyota, all these big production companies, but mass markets also for services, things like banking, 100,000 person professional consulting firms or professional services firms. These were mass products, and competitive advantage in that era took over from the advantages of, say, 100 years earlier, where it was itemized, customized little products made in small factories, which employed maybe 50 people, right? The biggest enterprises in those days were railroads, and everybody else was kind of small. So it was the sort of invention of Henry Ford, the invention of mass markets, that gave us current organizations as we know them. It gave us corporate law as we know it. It gave us the hierarchy and bureaucracy as we know it. And we tend to think today about bureaucracy as a bad thing. Believe me, when it was first introduced, it was a major improvement over what came before, which was a system called patrimonialism. And in a patrimonial system, everybody does everything for the person that controls the purse strings. And bureaucracy brought in specialization and experts and other sources of power and rules. And division of responsibilities. It was actually a big advance over what came before. And Max Weber, who is a sociologist, was the person who would define that. But that was then, and this is now. And we are now seeing very clearly that bureaucracy has its limits, hierarchy has its limits, and so we're kind of looking for what comes next. So what I'd like to share with you is some early perspective on what that might look like and some examples of firms that are starting to explore this. So I love this quote from Bill Anderson, who is the CEO of Bayer. So he inherited a disaster, right? But I love his quote about bureaucracy. He said, there was a time for hierarchical command and control organizations, the 19th century, to be precise, when workers were illiterate, information traveled at a snail's pace, and strict adherence to rules offered the competitive advantage of reliability. Today, the opposite is true. And he makes the observation that when he took over at Bayer, the employee handbook was 1,362 pages long. I don't know if you were required to memorize it or what, but it was certainly not a very wieldy kind of document. So what kind of organizations do we see today that are different, that are not machine bureaucracies, that are not tall hierarchies? And one that I've been following, which I really kind of admire, is a South Korean company called TOSS. So this company was founded by a gentleman named S.G. Lee, who had trained as a dentist. But he kind of had this entrepreneurial itch, started a whole bunch of companies, and the one that actually broke through was this company, TOSS. I think his parents are still bitterly disappointed at his career choice. You know, to leave behind a respectable, secure job as a dentist and go be an entrepreneur. Why would you do that? But anyway, he had this idea about how he would manage this company. And it's formed around a concept that he calls the directly responsible individual. And the unit of performance are small teams and groups who are given resources, or given access to resources, to pursue things that would not be really possible in a conventional bureaucracy, because what they are prioritizing, as does Amazon, as does some of these other internet companies, is speed to market, speed of execution, speed of experimentation. As Charles was saying just before this, you know, you work on it, you achieve something, you're great, and then it's garbage and you're going to go back to the beginning. As an example of the kind of thing that's possible at TOSS that would not be possible in a lot of machine bureaucracies is the way that they got into their YouTube network. So TOSS had a YouTube channel which was dedicated to what you would think a financial technology company, because that's what they are, would do. It gave financial advice and retirement advice and how do you invest and how do you do pensions. And then another part of the company, another person in another part of the company said, you know, yeah, that's great, but let's make a second YouTube channel with a totally different focus. We're going to make this second YouTube channel all about how money ties into things that have a cultural impact or that have an effect on people's ordinary lives. So how does money factor into fashion? How does money factor into Ford? In other words, personal interest stories about certain industries and how money intersects with them. And the two coexist beautifully. Now here's the thing, in a regular machine bureaucracy, there would have been a YouTube czar, and the YouTube czar would have had complete control over any resource dedicated to YouTube, and you never would have had that second channel. But the second channel now exists, it was created, and nobody sort of at a managing level in the company, they don't even think of themselves as having managers. As S.G. Lee said to me, we don't have a concept of senior management in this organization. We have circles, and they're circles of directly responsible individuals who do amazing things. They set each other's salaries. It's very transparent. They decide who gets compensated for what. They figure out, you know, what the resources need to be put for. But the overarching goal, as we saw with Patagonia, is very, very clear. It's to improve the everyday financial situation of the Korean economy. They're now globalizing. They currently are serving about 20% of all Korean citizens have a TOSS app of some kind, and they're becoming kind of a super app, which we see in China and other parts. So they're really doing very well. But I thought, rather than hear it from me, why don't you hear it from Mr. Lee himself?
Which is critical for you to have a really different working principle and team organization. For example, TOSS have 20 different teams, consist of 8 to 10 person. So they and each and every one is highly aligned, but it also loosely coupled. So each and every one decide the product's destiny. Like they decide their marketing budget, they decide where this product should go forward. They don't really report it to me. I mean, oftentimes I always get shocked about the speed of innovation that we made in our team, because they don't really share the information the product will going to change in a certain way. But in a sense, by doing so, we can just operate all those 30 over services really rapidly without losing any spark, really great spark, and still moving fast. And also each and every services has a really good quality. So having this kind of really different, really rather than hierarchy or top-down kind of teams, having this very autonomous team, it's really critical for my point of view. So, well, we last year, we launched over 100 services, and more than half of it just killed because it wasn't loved by the users and it wasn't have any code retention or so. So I think the speed of innovation is one of the critical thing for you to do. And in order to keep up that speed, you need to have a really highly coupled, highly aligned, loosely coupled team. And also, I think you just need to focus on the consumer's problems and needs, rather than making out of something you want.
Yeah.
So I hope you're hearing some of these common themes, right? Now, TOS is, again, not an easy place to work. You don't kind of come in and chill for the day. You're really at the cutting edge of creating innovations. And I think that's an interesting thing for us to think about, because we also have to consider what Nadia was talking about this morning, human energy, human perseverance. I think places like this, though, are much more engaging and exciting than places where you're sort of being put into a box and micromanaged. So I first learned about TOS at a conference where I think he was their CFO or their CMO was speaking, and he was illustrating the culture there with an example from the pandemic. And the Korean government had finally realized how serious this was and ordered people to go home. And there was a bunch of employees at TOS who said, well, we can't get our jobs done if we're not together working. So we're going to rent out hotel rooms where we can get together safely. We'll wear masks and socially separate, but we want to work together. And the company finally relented and said, all right, if you really want to come into the office, why don't you do that and save us the cost of a hotel room? But that's the kind of culture that they've got. People are just so into working together. So what I thought I'd do next is share with you 6 questions that you're then going to have the opportunity to reflect on with an app that my team has put together. Now, this is the first time we're doing it, so it might be a little glitchy, but in the spirit of experimentation, let's give it a try. There will be a QR code, and you will be able to have the opportunity to put some input in. And what we're hoping to do is use some of that to give you some feedback, either after the session or at the end of the conference, so that you can see kind of what other people were thinking about in terms of this. So question number 1, have we made things as simple as possible? Einstein very famously said, things should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. One of my favorite iconic leaders in this space is a woman named Sharon Price John. She is the CEO of Build-A-Bear Workshop, and she has this philosophy. When she came into this company, it was really in bad shape. It had been founded by an entrepreneurial genius, Maxine Clark. Those of you who know Build-A-Bear, you know its basic premise, right? You, as parents, you pay great money to provide the free labor that creates this woman's products. It's incredible. What a business model, right? But anyway, it kind of got to the stage where it had outgrown what Maxine could bring, and they really needed to bring in somebody with heavy-duty corporate chops. And what Sharon realized was Build-A-Bear at the time thought of itself as a workshop that was in malls that happened to have this brand. And she turned it on its head. She said, this is a brand that happens to have workshops in malls. And that led to a whole series of successive growth opportunities. But the first few years were rough. And she came into it with a very simple idea that you can borrow and take away tomorrow. She calls it SDSS times 2. Stop doing stupid stuff. That is the public term. She uses a more colorful one in private. And then once you've stopped doing stupid stuff, that should free up time so that you can start doing smart stuff. And to me, this is a beautiful example of simplification. And we've used the metaphor of murmuration a lot to illustrate this, which is, these birds have simple things that they're focusing on. They focus on like the 7 birds around them, and they don't get farther apart than this. And based on the environment that they're in, they can, without having to know the whole big picture or get a top-down directive, they can all move as one. And I think it's a nice metaphor for how we like to think of our organizations operating. Whoops. Next question. Are we thoughtful and intentional about loose versus tight coupling? Now, that's a term from computer science. Tightly coupled situations are sometimes very useful, but they tend to be most useful in situations that do not change a lot. Because if you've got a tightly coupled system, an issue in one part of the system has a ripple effect on everything else. So if you think about electricity grids, they're sort of built with breakers. What are the breakers there for? In your home, you've got breakers, right? They make sure that a problem in one part of your system does not flow over and affect everything else. The trouble with a lot of large bureaucratic hierarchies is that we've forgotten this basic message. And so we tightly couple a lot of things. So before you can I don't know, make a change to a website or shift, a bit of marketing material. You've now got to go to 15 different sister organizations whose work is somehow interdependent with yours. And it slows things down. It's a source of enormous frustration. Those of you who've been in, one or more meeting that you thought was a complete waste of time, you are experiencing the negative consequences of this. And I think an interesting way of looking at it is, how many people do you have to coordinate with? How many dependencies have you built in? Amazon is very famous for saying no team should be better than can be fed on 2 pizzas. And the reason why are these communication links. If you've got only 3 people you have to deal with, it's 3 links. If you've got 6 members, it's more links. And by the time you get up to 50 people you somehow get brought and create consensus and bring into your world, it's an almost unmanageable 1,225 links. And so I think when you're thinking of organizational design, give a lot of thought to where are you creating dependencies. More dependencies can sometimes, as I said, be necessary if you've got a stable, relatively fluid, unfluid situation. By the time you add a lot of dynamism, those dependencies will come out and kill you. So give some thought to that. Next question is, do we take a stewardship perspective? Aidan already mentioned Fujifilm, which I love to contrast with Kodak. Fuji said, we are going to focus on capabilities and we're not going to be afraid to reinvent ourselves. And you can see here, they started out as camera and film, they got into medical imaging, consumer skincare, personal medicines, all kinds of things. And they have actually got formal task forces that did this. And Onishi Minoru, who he mentioned earlier, was one of the very first to realize the significance of the digital revolution. And his resolve crystallized into action actually back in 1984, when Sony developed the very first all-digital camera, the Mavica. And Onishi said, this is it, we're moving on digital now. 1984, that's a long time ago. But they started moving, again, this idea of moving before you have to. Another firm that I love, and this is a firm that's not driven purely for profit. This is a firm that's driven to provide great jobs and a great community to artisans out of Detroit. The company's called Shinola, and they make things that are suitable for the capabilities of people that used to work in the auto industry. So they make bicycles, and they make watches, and they make beautiful bags. I must have 3 of them. But what's interesting about it is they're a capability out kind of company. They're like, we'll go anywhere where our artisans can make stuff that's beautiful quality that people would like to buy, but we're not driven primarily for the maximum profit we can get. So I think it's interesting, to ask this question, have we really thought about the stewardship perspective? Are we thinking for the long term, or are we thinking of extracting value, for whatever shareholders we have? Research shows, and this is a tough one, this is tough. Research shows the more resilient companies in any given performance period tend to slightly underperform companies that are being managed more conventionally. Now, why is that? They're reserving some resources for resilience. They're operating conservatively with respect to the resources that they spend. So they are not maximizing every single dollar out of every single time frame. Over the longer term, they are, however, more resilient, and they tend to outperform. So it's a function really of where you're looking in terms of time frames, something our current version of capitalism really struggles with. Okay, the next question is, are we operationalizing for healthy diversity? And by this, I don't mean the politically correct kind. What I mean here is, if you assume a hypothetical group of employees, and they each have between 1 and 10 qualities, but they're not all the same, right? And each of these qualities would help you to respond to some kind of environmental challenge. And if you look at this composition of this hypothetical company I've got here, you can see that only Chantel and Isaac have qualities that would allow them to respond to the challenges presented by condition 4 or condition 6. And I would argue that's not just a nice to have. Right? If you've got everybody in your decision-making team, everybody in your leadership team who's all the same, who's all homogenous, your chances of blind spots increase astronomically. So I think it's really worth thinking about that. It's a different way of thinking about who your talent pool is. A lot of companies, even today, they hire for cultural fit, which isn't bad. I'm not saying hire people who are going to destroy your culture. What I am saying is you want to hire people who have enough diversity to cover the range of challenges your company's likely to be presented with. Okay, have we built in trial and error processes and learning loops? So Aidan talked about the fact that trial and error learning systems are almost always not linear, right? They're exponential. They have some kind of multiplicative curve that makes it very difficult for human beings to get our heads around. So you need help, right? So this one I think is a lovely example. This is Netflix. And what they have at Netflix, and I believe it's a product they use themselves, but they also offer it to other people, it's a thing called Chaos Monkey. And what Chaos Monkey does is it's freely let loose to hammer Netflix's code in unpredictable and unexpected ways. So what it does is it sees where the weaknesses are inside the firm before it's exposed to a customer. I think this is fascinating. They're deliberately creating a sort of a hack that's going to be negative to their own code, so that they can fix it before it gets out into the world. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Another great example of this is a product called Catalyst AI, which has been commercialized by the big truck leasing company Penske. And previously, if you had a fleet of trucks and you wanted to plan your procurement, or you wanted to plan, whatever, big important decisions about where you were going to invest resources, the best you could do was an annual kind of benchmarking analog report. What Catalyst AI does is it actually digitizes information about fleets, like how much idle time and how much fuel they consume and where they're running and whether the conditions in one part or other. And then you can compare your fleet to all these other fleets in real time, so that you can make much more intelligent and much more real-time investment and planning situations. And it provides you with feedback. If you make a decision, you pretty instantly get data about whether it led you to the right path or not. I happen to think that's interesting. A trucking company is coming up with this AI catalyst thing that's going to allow you to plan better. I think that's a really interesting example. Then finally we have one of my favorite innovations is the Adobe Kickbox. And that's in answer to the question, are we making room for emergence and self-organizing innovation? And you saw that at TOS, right? I can get resources to start a second YouTube channel. I can form a team that's going to decide they want to come into the office, whatever the Korean government says. I can do things that allow me to make decisions as close to the edges as possible. So those are some 6 questions that I'm going to encourage you to ask yourself. This, I think, is a wonderful quote by the late Dee Hock, the founder of Visa. And he makes the point, simple, clear purpose and principles give rise to complex, intelligent behavior. Back to our starling murmurations, right? They're not planning it. They're acting on data in real time, those starlings. Complex rules and regulations give rise to simple, stupid behavior. And I think we've all got plenty of time over a glass of wine to share our stories of simple, stupid behavior that doesn't really work. Okay, so we're going to make it your turn. The next QR code you're going to see is going to take you to an app that you can use on your phone, and it's going to give you the opportunity to do just a little bit of reflection here, and then hopefully throughout the rest of the conference on how would you think about these 6 questions. As you're thinking about your organizational structure, where would you start? And before we do that, it's very typical for people to say, oh, well, my CEO would never agree, my head of division. You don't need to do that. You have agency over what you can control. So I'd encourage you to think about, how do I create little pockets of validation that this stuff actually works in whatever capacity that you have. So first thing is, how would you might apply these principles, the first 6 questions. And a bonus, Charles was talking about experimentation. How might you design some experiments to figure out whether this would work or not in your organization? So we're going to take about 15 minutes on this, and then I will be here if you have questions. I'd encourage you to think about it. We really want to make this as applied and practical for you as possible. So I'll stop there and let you give some thought to this. What a big advance over worksheets and clipboards and things. think I'll call us back to order. Many of you seem to be done. So my hope is that you can use these questions for your own reflection, that you can share them with other people at the conference, people at home. As I've said, we're going to collect the responses anonymously, and we'll be able to produce some input for you on kind of what other folks are trying with respect to these new management techniques. Comments, questions? Anything anybody would like to share? Yeah, yes, over here. Shout out so everybody can hear you.
I'm curious, the leaders that you encounter in your university, I think you were the one at Columbia, is that right?
I'm at Columbia, yes.
I'm curious with those questions, which are the ones that you think leaders you encounter resonate with, and which ones do they struggle to be open to?
At the university?
Yeah, with the people in leadership roles.
Sure. So the question, if you couldn't hear it, was how does my employer sort of stack up on this stuff? Well, yeah, we're a 270-ish-year-old organization, so we, over that span of period, you have the opportunity to collect a lot of barnacles. And universities are notoriously both very hierarchical. There's a really hierarchical structure, but they're also really interesting in that they're built for scientific exploration and creativity. So what you'll find is universities have, within that very sort of serious hierarchical structure, you'll have these pods of almost self-organizing cases, divisions, enterprises, grants organizations, research organizations. So it's a fascinating kind of constellation of expertise within a large bureaucracy. Like, don't even get me started on our system for reporting expenses. Like you could be here all day, and I would need a lot of liquid refreshment to get through that story. So on the one hand, they're incredibly bureaucratic, and this is really, really hard, and change is hard. Change is hard for them. On the other hand, we produce this incredible flourishing of knowledge because you've got these small units within the university that are kind of protected. So I'll give you an example of the kinds of things that we do that are different from what a lot of businesses do. So at a university, the faculty do not get their careers decided on by their superiors. And by the way, I suggest this all time to companies. If you want to reduce the return on politics in your organization, separate out the management authority structures from the promotion and pay structures. And we actually do that at a university. I don't report to my dean, who doesn't get to decide what I get paid or whether I get promoted. There's a thing called a promotion and tenure committee, and they evaluate you on your work output. So the return on politics to me in a university is like zero. I'll go have coffee with the dean once in a while if he invites me, but there's no kind of political thing there. So we have these very different structures, and I think one of the things that we do see is some of that's now being put at risk because it is seen as independent. It is seen as somewhat contrarian, and that's exactly the point. That's what universities were originally created to foster, was an independent set of judgments about, science and truth in the world. So I'd say for us, it's a hard transition. A lot of our very bureaucratic places are really bureaucratic. But I'd say the science part, the knowledge generation part, where you would see this sort of permissionless kind of thing, is very much alive and well in pockets. I hope that answered the question. I might have time for one or two more before we have to conclude. Yes, over here.
Thanks, Rita.
Oh, you've got a mic.
You spoke about this kind of permissionless organization being a tough place to work. Do you have any tips for people in terms of the kinds of mindset they should look for in people they recruit into?
Into those? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say you want people who are very curious. You want people who have been willing to make an investment in learning, even if it's not directly job related. So one of my entrepreneurial heroes is the guy who founded, his name's Jay Steinfeld, and he founded a company called Blinds.com, which later got acquired by Home Depot for $500 million. His total net investment in that company was $3,000. So real success story, great guy. And what he likes is he likes people who are independent thinkers, and he would call it a permissionless organization. And one of the interview questions he always asks is, what activities have you engaged in as an employee, as a person, that have improved your skills or given you new exposure to something or taught you something new, even if it's not work-related? And then he really indexes in on those people that like doing that. Another thing Jay does, which I thought was brilliant, was, we always talk about failure, and I make a big distinction between basic failures, which are sloppiness, shortcuts, things. We don't want to encourage those. That's not a useful failure. But intelligent failures, we like. And what he would do in the marketing department, he had 2 giant glass test tubes put up next to each other. And the one was a test tube with little balls outside, and there were silver balls and I think red balls or something. And if you tried an experiment and it didn't work out, you took a red ball and you put it in one tube. And if it did work out, you put it in the other tube. And then you wrote up a little note about what you'd tried. But what he was trying to get across was, we expect you to experiment, and we expect you to try stuff, and we know a lot of it's not going to work out. Just as you heard at TOSP, right? Half of what we unleash into the world, we withdraw again. We're not wedded to it. We're constantly trying to improve. So I think you want to look for that spirit of curiosity, that willingness to try something new, and not having fear. At Microsoft, they call this having a growth mindset. So anyway, I am around at the conference. Please catch up with me. I'll be part of other sessions, as you'll hear. For now, if you would like a copy of these slides, we've got another QR code. I am learning about QR codes in presentations. My staff has been incredibly helpful. Please feel free to click there, download them. If that doesn't work for you, just reach out to me. And it has been a sincere pleasure to be here and be invited to share some time with you. Thank you very much.